I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Community and Environmental Sociology here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. On behalf of my colleagues in the department, I want to welcome you all to the 2016 Slesinger Lecture. It's going to be my privilege to introduce Dr. Celeste Watkins-Hayes before she presents the lecture, which this year is titled Remaking a Life, Reversing an Epidemic, HIV/AIDS, and the Politics of Transformation. But before I introduce Celeste, I want to thank the individuals and institutions here that made this 5th edition of the Slesinger Lecture possible. First and foremost, I want to recognize the faculty, staff, and students in the Department of Community and Environmental Sociology for all of their support. I'd like to give particular appreciation to our chair, Gary Green, to current graduate student and soon-to-be NYU Shanghai faculty, Yifei Li, who is my student co-chair this year, and especially to our administrators, Ken, Megan, and Lee, for all of their hard work in making this year's lecture happen. I also want to acknowledge our co-sponsors throughout the university, the Departments of Anthropology and Sociology, the Global Health Institute, the Haven Center, the Human Rights Program, and the Institute for Research on Poverty. We also thank the University Lectures Committee for their generous financial support. And finally, I want to thank Provost Sarah Mangelsdorf for hosting a dinner in Celeste's honor last night. And I also want to share a few words about the lecture's namesake and benefactor, Professor Doris Slesinger. Doris earned her PhD in sociology here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1973. She joined the faculty of what was then known as the Department of Rural Sociology, now the Department of Community and Environmental Sociology, in 1974 and was promoted to full professor a decade later. A few years after that, the faculty chose Professor Slesinger to serve as their chair, a position no other woman had filled for a rural sociology department in the country. Throughout her life, Professor Slesinger was a passionate advocate for minority and women's health issues. Her research and service activities concerned the health and well-being of African Americans and Native Americans, migrant farm workers, and the rural poor. She retired in 1998, but remained engaged in university affairs until her passing in 2006. I'd like to share with you what Professor Leanne Tigas, who's here with us today, had to say about Professor Schlesinger later that same year, as her words ring more eloquently than anything I could say. Leanne said, "Doris was in the generation of women professors who were always breaking new ground. Academic women in the generations that followed have had a somewhat easier time because of the pioneers like Doris who forged the way, fought the early battles, and established the precedents. Doris actively and continuously tried to make our way easier by her service as an advisor and mentor to women graduate students and junior faculty. I've witnessed the love and loyalty felt by these women for Doris, and in the past months, their pain at losing her has been palpable. She was soft-spoken, but never unspoken. She was passionately concerned about fairness and justice, and she never forgot that people have many dimensions to their lives. Doris brought intelligence, honesty, and humor to all her activities and relationships. We will miss her, but we are so glad she was here for us." In 2007, the Department of Rural Sociology established the Doris P. Schlesinger Fund using a bequest that Professor Schlesinger left to the department. Today's Department of Community and Environmental Sociology subsequently decided to use that fund to support this lecture. This annual event honors Professor Schlesinger's legacy of research in health and social justice and stimulates campus-wide discussion of the principles of community engagement that are still enshrined in the Wisconsin idea. Given Leanne's words, it's especially gratifying to celebrate Doris's life by welcoming Celeste Watkins-Hayes to the University of Wisconsin, and no less on International Women's Day. As both an academic and activist, Celeste beautifully reflects Doris's legacy. The short biography in your programs can't possibly do justice to Celeste's career, and so I'll focus now on what's not printed there. Celeste is Associate Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at Northwestern University, and she's the former chair of the Department of African American Studies at that university, as well as a fellow of that university's Institute for Policy Research and their Cells to Society Center on Social Disparities and Health. She earned her doctorate and master's in sociology from Harvard University and her bachelor's summa cum laude from Spelman College, for which she recently served, as she told us last night, as the chair of the Presidential Search Committee. She's also on Spelman's Board of Trustees and on the advisory board for the college's Women's Research and Resource Center. That work on behalf of her alma mater is just one example of Celeste's remarkable record of service in the support of scholarship and scholarship in the support of service. In addition to her highly lauded book, The New Welfare Bureaucrats, Entanglements of Race, Class, and Policy Reform, and her many journal articles, which in and of themselves justify her inaugural Jacqueline Johnson Jackson Early Career Award from the Association of Black Sociologists, Celeste has also published extensively with high-profile media outlets, including the New York Times and the Atlantic. She makes regular appearances in the press as an expert on social inequality, and she's a Public Voices Fellow at the Op-Ed Project, a social venture founded by Katie Orenstein and that I urge you to look into, but after the lecture, not right now. She is, in short, a truly public intellectual. Celeste has also served on the board of directors of Test Positive Aware Network, an HIV/AIDS social service and advocacy organization, and the publisher of Positively Aware, one of the nation's top magazines for people living with HIV/AIDS. That service links directly to the subject of Celeste's lecture today. Her remarks emerge from her work as a principal investigator of the Health, Hardship, and Renewal Study, which explores the economic and social survival strategies of a racially, ethnically, and socioeconomically diverse group of women living with HIV/AIDS in Chicago. It's a vital and exciting project, and I don't want to keep you from hearing about it for much longer. So let me just brag that for the second year in a row, the Slesinger Lecture is taking place on the most beautiful day of the still relatively new year. Given that, I want to thank you for all coming in out of that sun and warmth to listen to what Celeste has to share.
Yes.
And with no further ado, to ask you to join me in giving her a welcome as warm as today's weather.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here, because I do recognize, being a Midwesterner, that it is always exciting when you have the first day of the year that's actually warm. Coming here, I looked up the weather report, it says 60 degrees. I said, I don't believe it. I brought my heavy winter coat, my hat, my scarf. I just don't believe it. And getting here and experiencing the warmth of outside, but more importantly, the warmth of this campus, the sociology community here, it has really been a wonderful couple of days. So thank you so much for hosting me. I want to thank, of course, specifically the Department of Community and Environmental Sociology for this invitation. I really want to thank Joshua Garoon for organizing this and Provost Mangelsdorf for hosting a fabulous dinner party last night. This university is so lucky to have Sarah as the provost. She is dearly missed as our dean at Northwestern. So it was great to see her. And it's really an honor for me to deliver the 2016 Doris Schlesinger Lecture, named after a scholar who made such an important imprint on the world and our scholarship on health and social justice. And Leanne's quote is just so appropriate. She was passionately concerned about fairness and justice, and she never forgot that people have many dimensions to their lives, And I want to underscore that. People have many dimensions to their lives, and it's in that spirit that I want to offer this presentation. Based on my current book manuscript entitled Remaking a Life, Reversing an Epidemic, HIV and the AIDS and the Politics of Transformation. So I look forward to hearing your ideas. Injuries of inequality, big and small wounds to personal, familial, and community well-being represent the mental, physical, and social toll of complex inequalities. From gunshot wounds brought by street violence to the lead poisoning endured by residents of an American city, these are the cumulative markers and scars of economic and social marginalization, the visible and invisible evidence of disadvantage. Injuries of inequality have gendered, racialized, sexualized, and class dimensions, as we know, as the likelihood of occurrence is not random, but shaped by social group membership. Injuries of inequality produce and are produced by a compromised ability to protect oneself from harm. Social science research has extensively analyzed the mechanisms that inflict injury upon disadvantaged groups, the causes of mass incarceration, residential segregation, and unemployment. We've documented the injuries themselves and their short and long-term effects and implications, outcomes around education, health, housing, and economic well-being. We've also looked at the ways in which individuals and communities respond, identifying the processes of identity formation, everyday survival, and political resistance in a context of constraint and confinement. Studying the lives of women living with HIV is a logical site to continue the exploration of injury. There are currently about 1.2 million people living with HIV/AIDS in the United States, with an estimated 50,000 new infections each year. It's well documented that AIDS is an epidemic of social inequality. Societal marginalization on the basis of race, class, gender, and/or sexuality play significant roles in determining who is most at risk of infection, who's most likely to receive life-saving treatment, and how the epidemic disproportionately affects certain communities. HIV operates as a concentrated epidemic in the US with high rates among specific populations. Blacks bear the most severe burden, making up only 12% of the US population, yet comprising 44% of both new HIV infections and people living with HIV in 2010. Black men who have sex with men represented 36% of estimated new HIV infections among all MSM in 2010. 1 in 4 people currently living with HIV is female, and the rate of new infections among Black women was 20 times that of white women in 2010. Geography and class intersect with the racialized and gender dimensions of the epidemic. It's estimated that 2.1% of heterosexuals living in high-poverty urban areas in the US are HIV positive, a rate well above the 1% that designates a generalized epidemic. Consequently, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention identifies poverty as the single most important demographic factor associated with HIV infection among inner-city heterosexuals. For individuals who experience intersectional marginality, HIV represents an important and significant threat to their health and well-being. But an interesting puzzle emerged as I began what has been over a decade of research on the lives of women living with HIV/AIDS in Chicago. I heard countless stories of trauma and struggle, but I also heard stories of transformation. Women talked about a trajectory of dying from AIDS to living with HIV. And I became deeply curious as the number of transformation accounts grew. Were these women simply offering rationalization and positive thinking to combat a deadly health scare? Was this merely a story about the effectiveness of highly active antiretroviral therapy and other medical discoveries used to treat HIV? Or was something else happening? Something that would shed light on the larger issue of what it might take for us to address the injuries wrought by intersectional disadvantage. What facilitates significant and even radical transformations in our circumstances and life chances? And one of the most jarring sentiments coming out of my research, I frequently heard the following: if it were not for HIV, I'd probably be dead. Lest this begin to sound like a dangerous and factually inaccurate narrative that romanticizes or downplays the devastation of AIDS, or points to some kind of deviance on the part of the participants of my research, let me be clear and reveal my argument up front. What these women were bringing to light is that the opportunities, and perhaps more importantly, the resources to personally heal from, economically and socially navigate, and politically confront injuries of inequality were granted when they gained access to a mammoth and well-connected network that afforded women the chance to massively restructure their lives. The transformations that these women experience are deeply social phenomena, where critical and meaningful interactions take place at the network, institutional, and policy levels that improve the quality of their lives. Explaining these transformations, the movement from death to life, in context of stigmatization and disadvantage, is the goal at the center of my work. There's a growing social science literature that captures life transformations in disadvantaged contexts, such as Edward Orozco Flores' God's Gangs, Lawrence Ralph's Renegade Dreams, Rob Sampson and John Lobb's Desistance from Crime or the Life Course, and Sharon Ossolin's Leaving Prostitution. While not explicitly framed as what I call a sociology of transformative agency until now, the texts nevertheless have several things in common. First, they identify key environmental challenges that constrain everyday life and long-term opportunity, and demonstrate how those forces inflict injuries of inequality upon those in their path. Next, they explicate the adaptive responses of individuals living under these conditions, and point to how some of these adopted strategies further undermine individuals' quality of life and life chances. Some behavior may be illegal, such as gun violence and drug dealing. Other behavior not illegal, but carrying a certain amount of hazard, such as sexual risk-taking. The strategies prove threatening to one's health and to the overall health of their communities. Where this research diverges from much of the urban poverty and inequality literature is in its focus on the social processes by which these same individuals later seek out alternative strategies and ways of being after previously adopted strategies prove problematic to the actor. For example, Orozco Flores documents the processes by which young Latino gang members, immigrants, or the descendants of immigrants struggling to make it in post-industrial Los Angeles, exit gang life by cultivating a reformed barrio masculinity through religiously oriented gang recovery programs. The men advance redemption scripts that describe their transformations from their perspectives, facilitating their recovery and carving out new spaces of legitimacy in a societal context that seeks to push them to the margins. To be sure, texts that document what I'm calling transformative agency explicitly and implicitly challenge explanations that point to a pathology to be fixed among these individuals. Through nuanced ethnographic work, these authors are able to show how transformative agency, just like the original adopted strategies, is deeply embedded in context, and the authors emphasize the policies and conditions that marginalize as well as those that facilitate the transformation. So since my work is about transformation, what supports it, what obstructs it, and what happens when people are able to do it successfully under difficult conditions, I have engaged in a longitudinal research project to deeply explore the process of what I call the transformative project. For over a decade, I've been conducting qualitative research with a group working through their own movements from death to life, HIV-positive women. My research team and I have explored how HIV-positive women transition from believing and behaving as though they have a death sentence, a diagnosis, to interpreting and coping with HIV as a chronic but manageable illness. But while this research is ostensibly about managing the health implications of HIV/AIDS, the broader goal is to think about how people reconfigure the ways in which they navigate complex and intersectional inequality and their injuries. In 2004, I began the Sister to Sister study, which is a qualitative study of 30 African Americans living with HIV/AIDS in Chicago. At the time, HIV/AIDS was the #1 cause of death for Black women aged 25 to 34 years old. While Black women comprised 37% of Chicago's female population in 2005, they accounted for 80% of female HIV diagnoses. By exploring a range of domains such as social support, economic survival, childbearing and child rearing, and intimate relationships, Sister to Sister sought to illustrate some of the ways in which HIV impacted the women's everyday lives, life chances, and social outcomes. My research assistant and I recruited women to speak with us through physicians, social service agencies, and word of mouth. We conducted at least 3 interviews with each woman, one of which included participant observation, in which we went with each respondent to a site where her HIV status was known and salient. We attended doctor's appointments and support group meetings, sat in the audience during their speaking engagements when they told their stories, visited them in their homes, and were among the earliest visitors after the births of children. While analysis in my book is drawn from all of the Sister to Sister participants, today I want to take you into the life of one woman in depth in order to map out what I'm calling the transformative project. I chose to focus on her because her story is illustrative of many of the stories that we heard from Sister to Sister women. In the book, I draw from 2 additional data sources in order to further contextualize the experiences of the Sister to Sister women. First, I present data from the Health Hardship and Renewal Study. HHR is an interview-based study of 85 HIV-positive women in Chicago that I conducted with several graduate and undergraduate students between 2010 and 2012. It provides an expansive picture of the experiences of women living with HIV in the city by interviewing HIV-positive women of diverse racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds. So the HHR study was designed to test the representativeness of the experiences of the sister-to-sister women by increasing the sample size and including Latinas and white women, allowing us to better understand how race informs the experiences of women living with HIV. In addition, HHR included a broader array of participants, more middle-class and affluent women, immigrants, and women who do not have strong connections to the HIV/AIDS service infrastructure, allowing us to test the validity of the arguments that I'm developing out of the sister-to-sister study. In the book, I also include data from interviews conducted with 25 AIDS service providers and activists. These are human service workers and advocacy organization leaders and staff who make up what I call the HIV/AIDS safety net. The purpose of these interviews was to trace how these organizations have shifted as the epidemic has evolved and the needs of clients have changed, from end-of-life care and activism around scientific research and social awareness to a focus on the immediate and long-term physical, social, and economic survival of their clients. So my talk will proceed in 3 parts. First, I want to use the case of a woman named Dawn to examine what a transformative project looks like in depth, tracing the what, why, and how of life transformation in a context of intersectional marginality. In part 2 of the talk, I discuss the infrastructure, the AIDS safety net, that facilitated Dawn's transformation and the transformation of several other women in the study. The AIDS safety net is both part of and distinct from our traditionally understood social safety net. In part 3, I move toward proposing a conceptual framework for what I'm calling the transformative project. My ultimate goal in this research is to identify the policy, institutional, and conceptual tools that propel the movement of individuals from a state of extreme social, economic, and physical distress and hardship to one of improved overall well-being. Importantly, this is not a story about upward mobility, a well-trodden area as we know in sociology and other disciplines. We will meet women who, by and large, do not experience major leaps in socioeconomic status. But what they do experience is a noteworthy shift from a social and near physical death to a life in which they are much more stable and better positioned to confront structural barriers in their paths. My theory, therefore, attempts to first recognize the agency of social actors living in disadvantaged contexts. Second, to highlight and account for the possibility of dynamic and significant change in the lives of stigmatized individuals in order to disrupt the narrative of the static actor in the urban poverty landscape. And third, I want to offer an analysis of the infrastructure that facilitates and sometimes undermines these transformations. So with this overview, let me introduce you to Dawn's story. Dawn Stevens grew up in a working-class neighborhood on Chicago's West Side in the 1970s and 80s that was precariously situated around several high-poverty areas. Her transition to adulthood occurred at a time of massive structural shifts in neighborhoods like hers. De facto racial and economic residential segregation and the lack of investment on the part of government and private businesses, limited paths for upward mobility for residents, including young adults. And this is well documented by folks like William Julius Wilson, Massey and Denton, Mary Patillo, and others. With the increasing availability of illegal drugs, the drug trade offered Dawn and many in Dawn's cohort seemingly fast money and easy emotional escapes from the blight that surrounded them. With rising intra-community violence, declining funding for health and other community services, and a mass incarceration boom that began to aggressively warehouse friends, family members, and neighbors, the barrier between life and death was becoming increasingly porous for young people like Dawn. When the sexual trauma of Dawn's childhood collided with the structural blows and deteriorating safety net confronting her community, the effects were combustible. The first instances of molestation took place when she was just 5 years old and would continue off and on until she was 16 at the hands of 2 different family members, including her stepfather. My village wasn't safe, Dawn tearfully recalled. Dawn told no one about the sexual abuse, convinced that her mother wouldn't believe her and her biological father would retaliate violently against the perpetrators and she would lose him to prison. But she acted out in other ways. She snuck sips of her father's drinks at house parties and began smoking marijuana and cigarettes in the 8th grade. By her sophomore year of high school, she was drinking regularly. By the time she was a 16-year-old junior in high school, her rebellion intensified. Tensions with both her parents escalated and she ran away from home, in part to escape the increasingly aggressive advances of her stepfather. I'd been sexually molested for years, so when I left home, I was crazy, Dawn reflected. She moved in for a few weeks with the person she idolized the most, her 19-year-old stepsister, Jackie. Jackie had already graduated to the fast life, shooting drugs intravenously and dating the neighborhood dealers who maintained her supply. When those relationships dried up, Jackie began to quote-unquote turn dates, selling sex for money and drugs. Dawn followed suit, learning how to inject drugs by observing Jackie and trading sex for drugs with the guys with whom she partied. Her habits became a source of deep disappointment and sadness for her family, who knew nothing about the molestation. Their lack of awareness fueled Dawn's sense of anger and betrayal, and she continued to distance herself. The environmental and personal turmoil in Dawn's life was occurring at the exact historical moment in which the AIDS epidemic was gaining an early and strong foothold in Black communities, quietly taking up residence in structurally compromised neighborhoods and networks and weaving itself into the epidemiological fabric. As we know from Kathy Cohen's work, from its early stages, the epidemic had a disproportionate impact on Black communities, and it would be years before the threat was fully understood and aggressively fought with prevention and treatment services. Singer and others have developed the concept of syndemics to describe the overlapping and mutually reinforcing epidemics of substance abuse, violence, and HIV that arise under conditions of severe health and social disparities. With a growing syndemic in her backyard, Dawn was diagnosed HIV positive the first time in 1985. The epidemic was still in its early stages, when the amount of information was limited and medical providers had few plans and protocols in place to guide the newly diagnosed. She left the hospital where she was informed about her illness with little understanding of what it meant. Dawn's drug use escalated, and it did not go unnoticed. Having recently come to terms with her sexuality, her first serious girlfriend asked Dawn to leave their shared apartment and insisted that Dawn's 6-month-old daughter, China, remain in the girlfriend's care. Dawn agreed, knowing she was in a deep spiral. This would be Dawn's third child to leave her custody. Several years prior, her grandmother, exasperated by Dawn's hard partying ways, demanded that the son that Dawn gave birth to at 17 live with her. A second son was born 3 years later in 1981, and Dawn's first cousin offered to raise him. In 1991, yet another daughter would be born and immediately taken by the foster care system. Frustrated and fed up, her family stopped speaking to her, beginning a silence that would last for 16 years. After exhausting all of her invitations to sleep on the couches of various friends, Dawn ended up on the streets a few years after her 1985 diagnosis. Abandoned buildings and hallways became temporary homes, and jail served as Dawn's way station when she needed a break from the streets. She was an active trader in a drug and sex market that was patronized by individuals of every race and class, from the city to the suburbs, but located squarely in the poor Black neighborhoods on the south and west side of Chicago that Dawn called home. There were a lot of white guys who came through, Dawn recalled, and a lot of them were looking for dates and to get high. Encounters with men who wanted to buy both sex and drugs from her were especially lucrative. For years, Dawn lived in a hamster wheel of drug abuse and sex work, incarceration, and sometimes sincere and other times half-hearted attempts at avoiding drugs. Her moves in and out of sobriety were motivated by a desire to stay clean, but the emotional scars of childhood sexual trauma could only be papered over for so long before the pain required numbing. In the absence of other tools, the drug marketplaces in the neighborhoods that she frequented offered an escape, but one that was obviously detrimental to her health. In 1992, several years after her initial diagnosis, Dawn was arrested for knifing a customer who attempted to sexually assault her. Instead of one of her relatively short stints in the Cook County Jail, she was sent to prison, where she was diagnosed HIV positive for the second time. In the penitentiary, when I went in and they asked me, "Have you ever had TB?" And I've had TB. And she goes, "Well, we've got to test you for HIV." I'm like, "Okay," and it didn't register that I already had this test. I didn't know what HIV was, what it meant to be HIV positive. So when they called me back to the healthcare facility, she goes, "Ms. Stevens, you have HIV." And I'm like, "Okay." And she goes, "Is there anything you need?" "No." And again, that was the end of it. There was no explanation. I still didn't know any more than I did the first time I got tested. So now 2 tests with no information. Dawn served her time, aware of her status, but unaware of the seriousness of the situation. She told no one inside the jail. "I didn't know what to tell anybody," she commented. Upon her release 3 years later, she entered an HIV education program offered by the county, the completion of which was a requirement for visitation with China, who was now living with a family in foster care after Dawn's ex-girlfriend passed. A whopping 10 years after her first HIV diagnosis, the county program served as Dawn's first substantive orientation to her condition. By this time, AIDS deaths in the United States were at an all-time high. The program kick-started the moment in which Dawn began to grapple with the meaning and significance of her diagnosis. The program facilitators informed Dawn about the practical implications of living with HIV. They told me that I was going to have it for the rest of my life, and that there were things I had to do, such as start sleeping again. I needed to take better care of myself. Dawn knew this would be easier said than done, given her circumstances. Homeless, estranged from her family, struggling with substance abuse, and embedded in a world of criminal activity with few opportunities for second chances, just living, let alone living with HIV, would be a feat. Dawn stayed clean for stretches, securing a spot in a transitional housing facility run by Catholic nuns, regaining custody of China, and celebrating almost 2 years of sobriety. But she struggled to fully escape the uncompromising grip of the drugs. She started using again, pawning everything that she owned to support her habit. She lost her job at a small nonprofit, her apartment, and custody of her daughter in a span of 6 months. China, Dawn explained, was smart enough at 12 to tell a teacher that I was using, so Child Protective Services came and got her. Dawn's health suffered tremendously as she returned to life on the streets. Contrary to the advice she received in the county program, she didn't prioritize her health. She barely slept. In addiction, she said, nobody thinks about health. When you don't feel good, you get high and you feel better. The depression comes when you're coming off the drugs. So you take another hit and you feel better. I was smoking crack all day, every day. She became a frequent patient in the emergency room with fevers and opportunistic infections. An ER doctor convinced her to try AZT, one of the first medications to be widely used for people with HIV. I spent my life in the bathroom and nauseated, she said, so I decided no more medication. I got back into my addictions. Viral loads shot up, T helper cells went down. At one point, the amount of HIV virus in her body was so high that she was diagnosed with full-blown AIDS. It was Dawn's 1999 stint in a housing facility for women struggling with both HIV/AIDS and drug and alcohol addiction called St. Mary's that began to turn things around for her. At 38 years old, remember she was diagnosed when she was 24. Dawn knew she was in desperate need of another chance to change course. I wanted to do something different, she said. Drugs were flowing freely in the neighborhood when I started getting high. At some point, they stopped flowing as freely, and I had to get out and hustle for them. And that got old. I guess if I had not had the mindset to do better, I'd probably either be dead, or still not locked there in my addiction. Because there's a lot of women who couldn't handle the frustration or the pressure that being in a sober environment 24/7 would put on them, and they would just disappear. So you definitely have to have your mind made up. She took her time, staying at St. Mary's for 2 whole years to make sure that she was strong enough to make it in the world without numbing herself with drugs. She began systematically gathering the tools that she would need to change her life's course. She finally absorbed and accepted the incompatibility between her drug and alcohol abuse and the management of her HIV and got clean. I realized, she said, the drugs were killing my body more than HIV. I decided that I wasn't ready to die. I didn't want HIV to take me out, so I had to stop getting high. Further radical changes would be necessary. Dawn became a proactive advocate for her health, approaching the healthcare system with a very different mindset and approach. I paid my physician a visit, she said. I did my research and had this list of unacceptable HIV medications that folks were saying were the most toxic. It just so happened that my doctor and I were on the same page. She recommended the same medications that I was thinking about trying out. So that was a good beginning for us because she had just become my doctor. Her stay at St. Mary's gleaned yet another positive effect. Dawn met a woman who was also in residence there, dealing with the same demons of drug abuse. Meeting at a transitional facility for women living with HIV also eliminated the challenging work of disclosure about her HIV status. I guess my mind told me that it was time to actually look for a long-term relationship, Dawn explained. I wanted to stop doing things the way I used to do them. When Dawn enrolled in 2005 in the research study that is at the center of my book, just 6 years from living on the streets, the distance between her former and current life was vast. Up most days at 6:30 in the morning, Dawn's family and her extensive work in the HIV advocacy community occupied the center of her focus. Dawn and Deanna had moved out of St. Mary's in 2001 and remained in a deep and loving partnership. Two souls who had each other for support as they created new ways of being in the world. Like any couple, they had their pet peeves. Deanna found it endlessly frustrating that Dawn often turns off her cell phone or refuses to answer it when she chooses not to be disturbed. But then she'll answer my phone for me and go, "Here, it's for you." "Well, no shit, it's my cell phone," Dawn laughed. But Dawn saw this period with Deanna by her side as one of the best in her life. There was someone in her romantic life who cared about her, who quote unquote kept her in line and wouldn't allow her to withdraw into herself. Perhaps that was at the root of their tiffs about the phone. Part of their new life was reminding each other that they had obligations to people, obligations that mattered. In the throes of addiction, Dawn's 4 children were taken away one by one. When we met her, she and Deanna were now the trusted caretakers of a 4-year-old girl named Daisy, whose teenage mother asked Dawn and Deanna to care for the girl from the time the baby was 6 months old. I did the potty training, I got her out of diapers, all the shots, doctor's visits, we read together. Deanna likes to let Daisy help her cook. When we got her, she was rocking and pulling her hair out. She's stable now, mentally, physically, and emotionally. Dawn's personal story has also led to her political work. For more than a decade, she's been a prominent voice in the HIV community, a trusted leader. She has traveled the country speaking to groups about HIV prevention, meeting with politicians, including Nancy Pelosi, to advocate for increased funding for AIDS programs and services, and serving on the boards of some of the most prominent national and local AIDS organizations. "I think my real work comes from being an activist and an advocate," she commented. "The only risky behavior that I do now is telling a politician what I really think of them." As her political engagement built both her confidence and network, Dawn parlayed her volunteer work into paid employment in various human service organizations in the city, dealing with issues ranging from domestic violence to homelessness to HIV. She's worked as the assistant director of a small housing program, a case manager, and a personal assistant for people living with HIV/AIDS. Over the course of 10 years, my research assistants and I would come to interview Dawn more than half a dozen times, tracing the physical, social, economic, and political transformation of her life. When we met her, her long gray dreadlocks reflected a 20-year journey with HIV, evolving into a 30-year journey by the time we conducted our last interviews with her in 2015. Daisy, now 14, is thriving in Dawn's care. 16 years free of alcohol and illegal drugs at this writing, Dawn still bears the scars of her previous life, walking with a cane and struggling with a variety of old injuries incurred on the streets. But with a viral load that is undetectable, the presence of HIV virus is minimal in her bloodstream, held in check with only one prescribed pill that Dawn takes daily, a far cry from her once 25-pill-a-day regimen. Since the turning point that she experienced at St. Mary's, Dawn has embarked on an extensive process of learning how to live with HIV, reluctantly but successfully finding a place for it in the fabric of her life. During one of my conversations with her, Dawn offered the challenging assessment that I earlier described. If it were not for HIV, I'd probably be dead because I never would have stopped getting high. This admission may sound shocking. Obvious fodder, right, for those who seek to further stigmatize HIV-positive women with histories of substance abuse, to use Dawn's stories as a justification for apathy towards the epidemic or the deployment of punitive tactics of social control for women like her. It's a deeply ironic statement as well. How can a life-threatening illness, responsible for the deaths of millions around the world, actually help prevent a death? Addiction, with its roots in Dawn's history of childhood sexual abuse, was shaping every aspect of her life, from her tools of economic survival on the streets, to her residential choices, to how she formulated, sustained, or damaged relationships with friends, family, and intimate partners. And her broader environment, depleted of many opportunities and resources, also had obstacles that elicited a variety of coping and survival strategies that were destroying Dawn's health. Changing that operating system, her her mode of navigating the tremendous frustrations and pressures around her would demand intense work on her. HIV would require her to manage her health differently. But addressing the diagnosis would also demand that she find new ways to navigate the economic and social hurdles that had previously hobbled her. HIV rendered her prior coping and survival strategies untenable if she had any hope of staying alive. Acknowledging her past, Dawn nevertheless chose to create a future for herself by living another kind of life. So in part 2, I want to think about remaking a life and the role of the HIV/AIDS safety net. So how do women remake, not simply rebuild, their lives after traumas associated with social and economic disadvantage? How does a woman homeless and feeding a drug addiction through sex work while her children are taken away from her one by one become a leader in her family and community, advocating on behalf of countless women and men and speaking truth to power? How do women go from dying from AIDS to living with HIV? Rebuilding suggests a return to a prior state, but remaking is much more dramatic. It's transformational. We often think of significant life conversions as highly personal and individualistic experiences, perhaps even spiritual in makeup. There's a whole self-help industry based on that. But I argue that life transformations are in fact deeply social events, negotiated processes influenced by the people, places, and policies that we encounter. The companion story to Dawn's remarkable life transformation is the transformation over the same 3+ decades of the epidemic that threatened her life. The extraordinary conversion of HIV/AIDS from an inevitable death sentence to a manageable chronic illness is in well-resourced countries like the United States is not only one of the most noteworthy medical achievements of the past 35 years, it's also one of our most significant social achievements. Activist institutions were on the front lines, driving the medical community and government to invest significant dollars in research and shaping a public dialogue that increased awareness and pushed HIV/AIDS to a high perch on the list of societal concerns during the epidemic's most destructive periods in the U.S. Largely viewed as central to the gay rights movement, the fight against AIDS was also a fight against homophobia and sexual discrimination. While AIDS activism arguably privileged the needs, experiences, and struggles of white, middle-class gay men, women living with HIV have also been active participants in AIDS mobilization, using their stigmatized identities as a source for political and self-empowerment and advocating for a more inclusive approach to fighting the epidemic, a fight that still continues. Perhaps one of the most important but undercredited and under-theorized outcomes of AIDS mobilization in the United States and in other well-resourced countries is the emergence of an extensive HIV/AIDS support infrastructure, what I call the AIDS safety net. This is a network made up of nonprofit AIDS human service providers, advocacy organizations, the social security system, healthcare providers, and the substance abuse recovery community. In my previous work, my graduate research assistants, LaShonda Pittman, now an assistant professor at the University of Washington, and Jean Beeman, now an assistant professor at Purdue, and I developed a concept called framing institutions in an article that appears in the journal Social Science and Medicine. And we argued that framing institutions help HIV-positive women move from physical and social death to life by offering, one, critical information about one's status and a conceptual framework to understand its implications, language to talk about one's condition, and resources and networks to begin restructuring one's life post-diagnosis. And we see the role of St. Mary's as a critical framing institution for Dawn. These framing institutions, often invisible to those not reliant upon them, point to a potential avenue through which severe social and economic advantages can begin to be ameliorated. In Dawn's case, it wasn't the HIV diagnosis per se that sparked the change of course that we heard about today. Along with the medical and pharmacological discoveries that evolved over the decades since her HIV diagnosis initially, a safety net emerged that offered Dawn new strategies to confront the deadly triad of sexual abuse, poverty, and HIV/AIDS that illegal drugs were proving ineffective at addressing. Perhaps the deadly risk of AIDS created the final spark of urgency, but it was the institutional infrastructure that supported the change. As an institutional broker to build upon Mario Small's work, St. Mary's provided a roof over Dawn's head as she embarked on her transformative project and reconstituted the pieces of her life. St. Mary's also connected her with a network of AIDS service providers that would help Dawn physically survive by introducing her to a physician who perfected her HIV medication regimen, economically survive by assigning a case manager who helped her get access to financial resources, and socially survive by connecting her to HIV/AIDS support groups. Those relationships then facilitated her entree into the city's AIDS activist and advocate network, which led to a measure of political influence and economic opportunities. As we go deeper into analyzing Dawn's transformative project, we see her continued movement, and if you start at the top of the visual in terms of thinking about the injuries of inequality, moving on to her survival and coping strategies that she's previously using to numb inequalities injuries. And we see this movement. We see a clear relationship between the cognitive shift that determined for Dawn that, quote unquote, something had to change. Then we see the AIDS safety net, a set of institutional relationships that anchored and supported that conceptual shift, that cognitive shift. And then we see a new modus operandi that sustains the movement from death to life. All three of these, the cognitive shift, the role of the safety net and framing institutions, and this new modus operandi, all three of these are necessary conditions for the transformative project to occur, I'm arguing. The groundwork laid by framing institutions is sustained over time in the best case scenario as the women reformulate their identities, have experiences that validate their new roles, and continue to have access to opportunities and resources that solidify their newfound survival strategies. For example, one of Dawn and Deanna's first decisions upon leaving St. Mary's in 2001, and this part of the story becomes important because it helps to explain what sustained the shift finally, right? How was she able to maintain this shift over time? So one of Dawn and Deanna's first decisions was leaving St. Mary's upon leaving St. Mary's in 2001 was choosing where they would live. Deanna received a voucher for subsidized housing in a lottery run by a local AIDS organization in 2001. They renewed the assistance for more than a decade, reducing their rent in 2015 from $750 to $375 a month. Moving away from Dawn's previous neighborhoods meant moving away from spaces that held memories of her life in the throes of addiction and the people who had seen her at her lowest point, not all of whom enthusiastically supported her new path. Traversing the city once settled in their new apartment was made possible by packs of free bus cards given to the couple by Dawn's case manager at St. Mary's, increasing the ease with which Dawn and Deanna could make doctor's appointments, attend support group meetings, and get groceries for the house. Once the issue of long-term housing was settled, Dawn adopted additional strategies to manage her health. The physician who prescribed a viable medication regimen when she was at St. Mary's referred Dawn as specialists to address some of her other health concerns. Dawn also began seeing a therapist, working hard to repair the emotional injuries and process the sexual violence that she experienced. As former participants in the drug economy, Dawn and Deanna next had to fashion an entirely different set of economic survival strategies, one that did not put their lives at risk. Because of her numerous health challenges, Deanna qualified for Social Security disability insurance. Dawn worked in various nonprofits until her chronic and severe back and hip pain meant that she too eventually started receiving Social Security disability benefits after a long fight to demonstrate her eligibility. Like many of the women with whom we spoke in this project, Dawn also leveraged her experiential capital, using the knowledge and wisdom derived from life's traumatic events to lend her voice in the AIDS advocacy community, generating speaking engagements and volunteering to participate in research studies, like mine, to help pay the bills, a strategy that has implications that we might consider during Q&A. To be sure, Dawn described her family as barely above the poverty level, and things certainly aren't easy. Nevertheless, Dawn's new financial operating system offered more physical safety and a fundamentally different approach to handling economic stress. She says, "It's like my sponsor says, the devil tries everything to get you to come back to his way, but he doesn't have any new tricks. I had my car repossessed last night. That's an old trick. I'm not falling for it. Back then, I didn't have money for rent, credit cards, light, gas, car note, any of that. And I just would give it all up to go get high. Wander the streets and be homeless, but I had no responsibilities. But I also had very little contact with my children. So it's just not worth it. I'm not there today. Been there, done that. That's why I emphasize that the mobility that we observe here isn't the socioeconomic mobility marked by gains in education, income, and wealth that sociologists typically count as quote-unquote legitimate mobility. Rather, this mobility animated a transition from dying from to living with. And yes, perhaps some improvement in social standing, but most importantly, improvements in the basic level of health and well-being in terms of housing, income, physical and psychological health, and socially supportive relationships. Of course, if there's an area in Dawn's life that seemed much harder to repair and remake, a place where her transformative project has its limits, it's in her relationship with her biological children. She worked hard to reconnect with them when she got clean. China, now 28, plays an important role, serving as the family's anchor by keeping in close touch with her siblings, and she did this while her mother struggled for all those years. As the child with the most contact with Dawn growing up, China, quote, saw a lot of stuff and I had to explain a lot of stuff, Dawn lamented. Her sons, now 35 and 33 years old, and her daughter, now 22, each engaged Dawn very differently. None of Dawn's children are HIV positive. When her oldest son found out Dawn's status from a gossiping relative, he told his mother that he could have gone his entire life without finding out. Her youngest son is also unwilling to talk about it, but will occasionally check in to ask Dawn if she's taking her meds and to visit her to see how she's feeling. 22-year-old Abby lives out of state. During one of our last interviews in 2015, Dawn had just returned from visiting her, and Abby allowed her mother to return to Chicago with Abby's daughter to visit the rest of the family in the city, a huge show of trust. During one of our interviews, I asked Dawn to recount a time in her life when she felt the most accepted as a woman living with HIV. She described being elected to the city's HIV strategy group, a federally mandated coalition of service providers, public health officials, and affected and infected community members that established the service priorities for the allocation of Ryan White funds. These dollars provide medical and social support for people living with HIV. So this is a high prestige group that helps to determine how the resources will be distributed as it relates to HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment services in the city. And she said, with the strategy group, it didn't really matter that I was HIV positive, she explained. It was important, obviously, but not as important as who I was and what my capabilities were. Plus, you get elected from other people that are on that body, and they've got to think a lot about you to make you one of the spokespersons for the entire city on HIV. A very different existence from her period of homelessness, drug abuse, and sex work, Dawn had remade her life. So as we think about moving towards theorizing the transformative project, I say this: by analyzing the lives of stigmatized women as they grapple with their past and present while creating a future for themselves, my book traces what I'm calling this transformative project. And I define the transformative project as a multi-dimensional process by which individuals fundamentally shift how they conceptualize, strategize around, and tactically address struggles related to the complex inequalities that affect their everyday lives. So it entails the adoption of a radically different set of approaches to negotiate questions of physical, social, economic, and political survival, concerns that are at the center of a life of intersectional disadvantages. Remaking a life, or the transformative project, goes beyond stress-related growth by integrating newfound physical, social, and economic survival and mobility strategies to improve overall well-being after one has been confronted with some of the harsh, direct, and indirect effects of racism, poverty, sexism, and homophobia. It involves altering the ways in which one engages in micro-level interpersonal interactions, and we saw how Dawn kind of shifted her strategies of how she interacted with the people in her life, with meso-level institutions and neighborhoods, the residential choices that she made, the ways in which she engaged with institutions to get the necessary support, and the ways in which she contributed to institutions for political advocacy work. And it also incorporates altering the ways in which one engages, even with macro-structural arrangements like public policy. So thinking about her role as it relates to AIDS advocacy, It's more dynamic, I argue, than resilience or coping. The transformative agency, what I think animates this transformative project, what's the fuel for the transformative project, represents women's distinct and deliberate moves or attempted moves from what was to what can be. Therefore, under certain circumstances, the transformative project can produce significant changes to one's life trajectory. At its core, the transformative project is not about personal transformation as an end in and of itself, what we commonly think of as self-help. It's not about fixing alleged deficiencies, nor is the transformative project a repackaged elixir of personal responsibility reducible to the bootstrap climbs of American lore. Rather, the transformative project is about the integration of agency, or to be more specific, transformative agency, with environmental networks, institutions, and policies that support women's efforts. So by charting that process and using the case of the AIDS infrastructure as a kind of case study, we're able to see the resources at women's disposal, the barriers they confront, and my work hopefully explicitly challenges the highly individualistic personal responsibility frame that's dominant in discourse around both HIV and social and economic disadvantage. We see the ways in which Dawn's desire wasn't enough. There had to be an infrastructure that helps to support her change. As such, a discussion of women's transformative agency should never be decoupled from the social, economic, and political conditions that women seek to escape or alter. So it's important to note what this project is not and what it's unable to do. Its deployment does not suggest that the challenges in women's lives can be eliminated or reduced solely by the power of positive thinking. There's hard work involved to test out and struggle with the new strategies. By no means is the process of remaking a life rapid and linear, and we saw that with Dawn's story of the fits and starts, marked by periods of improvement followed by crushing setbacks at times. Women's progress in transforming their lives does not inoculate them from the punishing health, economic, and social hurdles that they continue to confront. Regardless of their agency, the women in this study are still living with a serious health issue that can end their lives if not appropriately managed. They still confront massive structural barriers that need to be attacked, which is why in this conceptual rendering, I show how women's longer-term status change still confronts injuries of inequality, which is why the arrow goes back up to the injuries, right? Because that's still something that they struggle with. But now there are new survival and coping strategies and tactics to bring to bear on responding to inequality. As a result, some of the women that we spoke with were never able to move beyond the shock of diagnosis and other traumas to launch a successful transformative project. In those cases, in those moments where there wasn't that movement from dying from to living with, I believe that part of what explains that variation is that some aspect of this process, the cognitive shift, the relationships with framing institutions, the longer-term change in status from death to life, and all of the different ways in which people had to really change how they thought about economic, social, and physical survival. Those are the instances, I think, where it has yet to coalesce, and I think that helps to explain why some women still stay stuck and have that struggle. As I conclude, my work seeks to raise a universal question. How do human beings remake their lives after individual and or structural trauma? And what conditions best support these efforts? For the women in my book, their HIV status provided access to a safety net that enabled significant and sustained change. This is a sobering reality. It suggests that our societal safety net has been perversely shaped to intervene only when citizens are already deeply injured, rather than playing a more preventative role, as the primary category of eligibility is not need, but a serious and perhaps deadly health threat. The fire must be raging before we install the fire extinguisher. At the same time, the AIDS safety net, pushed by the strong mobilization of activists, deserves a significant amount of credit for building this infrastructure and helping to transform this epidemic. In partnership with medical and pharmacological advances around HIV prevention and treatment, it offers support for women to address their HIV diagnosis alongside other survival concerns. In these early days of the implementation of the Affordable Care Act and our continued discussions around inequality and its injuries, the supports offered to women in my research who embark upon transformative projects provide a model for how we might think about assisting all low-income individuals, not just those who are living with HIV. Thank you. So thank you for listening. I would love to take questions. This book project is very much in progress. But I think that, as I look at and analyze all of the data that we have, this story best characterizes what we learned from talking to over 100 women who are currently living with HIV in Chicago. So my hope is that, yes, this tells a story about where we are as it relates to the AIDS epidemic, but my broader goal, and I hope that I communicated that, is to get us to think about how people are navigating inequality and some of the different ways in which people are figuring out how to navigate these injuries of inequality, and to extrapolate broader lessons as we think about our social safety net, as we think about our healthcare system, and as we think about life for those at the bottom of our social ladder. So with that, I'm excited to take your questions.
I'm going to let Celeste moderate these herself with just a logistical interjection that there's a reception following this. We have plenty of time for Q&A before this, but I would also urge you, Celeste will be there, and there'll be opportunity to talk with her after, and there's food and drink there as well, which will just be outside the atrium. So with that, Celeste, I'm going to let you call on people.
Okay, sounds great.
We don't have a microphone, so please do speak up.
Yes.
Absolutely fantastic material. I was moved by it in so many ways. And I really like the contrast with resilience. The discussion about resilience sometimes sounds so much like another blame the victim kind of thing. If I'm resilient, well, that's just the kind of person you are. So this is really great. I just had one question about how important is the politicized character of the mobilization around HIV/AIDS,
Yes.
rather than just the social infrastructure. So the politicization and movement, of course, creates an infrastructure.
Right.
But if we contrast, for example, AA, which is an infrastructure, after all, and it does matter to people,
Right.
it's an infrastructure, but it's not politicized in the way that the HIV was. If you just give me some thoughts on how important, in Dawn's case,
Right.
speaking just in that particular story, was the fact that this was actually a social movement.
Right. Right.
Mobilized some people.
I love that question. Thank you for that question. And I think it's very important, right? Because we often think about, your point is very well taken. There are other kinds of social support networks. There's other kind of illness-based networks. So what's distinct about HIV? And so much of it was the politics, right? So when you think about, and one of the things that I'm trying to do in one of my chapters is to think about how those politics informed not just the building of that infrastructure, but the ethos that undergirds that infrastructure, such that it's been relatively effective for women. So a couple of aspects about the infrastructure. Number one, the face of it was not women like Dawn. And let's be honest here, this is where it gets kind of politically complex. The face of this infrastructure and the epidemic and the mobilization were pretty much white, middle-class gay men. So the ways in which racial privilege, economic privilege were able to put this in many ways at the forefront of our set of societal issues in the 1980s and 90s, the ways in which those resources were able to brought to bear, the ways in which so much of the mobilization around HIV was creating a humanizing face of the epidemic, I think became really important, number one, in terms of the subsequent resource flow. So this was a community that could raise its own resources, right, within the community, but could also attract external resources through its mobilization. So it created a particular kind of economic infrastructure. It created also a certain humanizing of the epidemic, and it created this conversation around stigma, right? Because so much of the conversation was about pushing against sexual stigma, but that really permeated throughout much of what we think about with AIDS infrastructure. So the experience of getting services at an AIDS organization feels different than the experiences of what we know in terms of getting services at a poverty organization, right? Where there's a lot more, unfortunately, stigmatization that often happens when we look at the work on welfare offices and other organizations that are targeting low-income individuals. So there's a way in which this resource base, this kind of politically active class that was marginalized on the basis of sexuality, but nevertheless privileged on the basis of race and class, was able to create a somewhat protected infrastructure. And let's not forget also the marginalization that was happening for even that group. So the Ryan White Fund is named after a child, right, who was living with HIV. So even there were moments within the mobilization that even that level of privilege wasn't enough, right? We had to find a child to kind of think of as the face of HIV. So the AIDS mobilization effort was very strategic in terms of who got presented as the face of AIDS in moments, and it allowed cover in some ways to not make the epidemic, to really, it provided cover in a way that what got obfuscated was the fact that from the beginning of the epidemic, there has been a disproportionate impact on communities of color, and there has been a disproportionate impact on poor communities. But that hasn't been the narrative of AIDS. It's been that's a much more recent narrative, even though that's actually been part of the epidemic from the very beginning. So I think that so much of this, thinking about your question, is how did those politics inform the resources that got embedded in the infrastructure, the political cover that the infrastructure experiences, and the ethos of the infrastructure? Thank you so much for that question. Yes.
So, I was wondering, I loved the presentation, and I was so caught up in Dawn, right? You know, I mean, what a great story. But I worried at the end about having Dawn as the symbol, you know, that somebody that incredibly strong, right, who remade herself in such a dramatic fashion, right? I mean, to become a spokesperson, and I mean, you know, not simply just to be able to be self-sufficient and stuff, but to have the positions that she held. Is there any, I worry there's a danger in her as your symbol of remaking.
I completely understand, and it's something that I think about all the time, right? So the reason I chose Dawn, for a couple of reasons. Number one, I'm struck in the data by how common her story is. She's not the outlier in our data, she is pretty common. And what we were so struck with as we did field work were the number of women who had this story of transformation. They might not have all ended up as activists, right, who were meeting with politicians and traveling the country, but they were running the support groups, right, which have but back to the ethos, it's a they tend to be often peer-led support groups, so that a woman like Dawn may not have an opportunity to meet Nancy Pelosi, but she's leading a support group every Tuesday. And when people are coming in crisis, she's the one standing up and saying, let's, you know, participate in prayer, let's think about this, let's talk about the latest medical advances, et cetera, et cetera. So that was one of the things that really struck us by just how common this transformation story is for women who are the most marginalized. But throughout the book, we also talk about the counterexamples, right? The women who struggled and didn't end up where Dawn was, or had kind of backsliding experiences where they ended up back in that dying from state. We talk about the women who, for them, the transformation is just, I'm able to raise my kids and be in a relationship and take care of myself. And that's the transformation. I'm not an activist, but I'm still nevertheless transformed in this particular way. So I do think that the data are suggesting that the transformation experience is pretty common. What's different is what does the transformation look like in terms of its end state? Is it transformation to the point they're influencing so many other people, or transformation to the point they're just influencing their immediate social milieu? Does that answer your question?
It does. I guess I just worry, I know that your mission is to highlight the institutional,
Right.
basis, essentially, of this, that it's not individual
Right.
determination. It's,
Right.
It's not this individual personality characteristic. And yet, in the telling, it was maybe just because I'm, so much, because of so much of what we hear gets us to focus on the cult of personality. That even as a trained sociologist, you kind of pick up
focus on
personality.
that. So one of the things that I might want to think about, and this is really helpful, is, and I'm thinking about this as I write the book, is really breaking down what the infrastructure did. Right? So how was it that, I could only do it so much in a talk, but when she talks about joining the AIDS strategy group and becoming an activist and doing speaking engagements, those things didn't just happen, right? It was the infrastructure that was saying, you're really good at speaking, why don't you think about this? Or you're really good at leading support groups, why don't you do this? There's a way in which the infrastructure identifies people's talents and helps them kind of and this is part of the economic transformation project, right? Because these women have to find new ways to make ends meet. So part of what the kind of AIDS infrastructure does is helping women figure out how are you going to economically survive and what skills can you bring to bear, whether it's speaking or participating in these organizations. And I can talk more about, and I do talk about in the book, how that happens at the organizational level. And that goes back to this point about AIDS activism, because so much of that was the activists figuring out, there's this great story about how so many activists learned they practically had to become physicians to understand the disease and to understand the medications, because in order to make a change and to fight, they had to know almost as much as the FDA folks had to know and the NIH folks had to know. So there's a way in which there's a kind of professionalization that happens in a kind of way, and it's not individually based, it's about the infrastructure that generates that. So I can definitely play that out more. Thank you so much for that. Yes?
Thank you so much for that. I mean, I'm still absorbing the emotion of it, which is really intense. And I really appreciate that somebody ought to install a fire extinguisher. And I don't want to diminish that and keep that front and center. And then also ask you about, okay, so the folks who are past the fire extinguisher point, who you've interviewed, are there things that you're seeing, noticing about better organizing strategies, infrastructure tweaks, things that people can do so that more people experience the transformation?
So are you asking kind of what the institutions can do and how the infrastructure can be bolstered?
I don't know if I'm asking about bolstering the infrastructure or other, asking about how people can organize.
Interesting. Well, certainly, one of the things that I think about as it relates to organizing is this is a infrastructure that, while right now exists, is in a precarious state, right? Because HIV is now thought of as a chronic manageable illness. Why do we need the Ryan White Care Act? There's the mobilization efforts are not as strong as they used to be. There's an argument that other issues, particularly within the gay rights community, have moved on to center stage, like marriage equality and things like that. So this infrastructure, I think, is a place where activism, we can't take this for granted. And the place for mobilization is to think about how do you maintain this structure for people living with HIV. But I think that the broader activism message is about what have we learned from this case that can apply more broadly, right, to other disenfranchised populations. And we see, for example, the ways in which basic services around housing, it can't be underestimated that Dawn had a place to live for 2 years while she dealt with the kind of emotional demons. She got clean, she started to develop this infrastructure. So she wasn't focused on basic day-to-day survival. She had the mental space to be able to think about, okay, I've got to reconfigure some things. And, you know, particularly when you think about somebody like Matt Desmond's work, you know, that kind of housing precarity that he highlights makes it so that this kind of transformative project is much harder to do if you're facing something like basic housing instability. Access to health care is another example. So the way in which Dawn is able to, you know, the Affordable Care Act will be really interesting to watch in this regard. The ways in which she was able to plug into an infrastructure where she always had access to physicians. Like, we asked a lot of questions over the more than 100 women. How's your doctor? How's your access to health care? And it was largely positive. People were even saying, oh, you should come and meet my doctor. She's great. Because an infrastructure had been built around medically addressing HIV, where people felt like it was good quality service, it wasn't stigmatizing, they were getting the information. I would ask, one common question we would ask is, do you think you're getting the same kind of medical care as, say, Magic Johnson? Do you think your experience with the epidemic is different? And they would say, no, he's on the same drugs as I am. We're both on Kaletra, so no. Now, they would say, oh, he's got a nutritionist and all of that, but in terms of dealing with the virus, he's getting the same access as we are. So there's a level of kind of medical infrastructure as well that creates the space for women to be able to engage in these harder and more complicated questions. It's hard to deal with the demons of childhood sexual abuse if you're worried about where you're going to live. It's hard to get clean if you're worried about healthcare. So I think that this offers such an interesting model of, you know, how we can create a holistic infrastructure for women. And one of the, you know, critiques that I'll probably get is, oh, but this is so expensive. But if you notice, Dawn moved in and out of usage. It wasn't a constant. There were moments where she needed the infrastructure more times than others, and she contributed to the infrastructure, right? So if we start to think about it in those terms as opposed to dependence, right? Dependence is not a word that you hear in the AIDS community. It's a word you hear in the poverty community, but it's not in where they're trying to battle that narrative. Not a word that you hear in the AIDS community, but yet usage of services. So I think some of the activism around changing the language, around making sure that we're protecting this existing infrastructure and we're extrapolating lessons for infrastructures that can address the needs of a larger swath of the population, I think is a good way to go. Thank you for that. Yes, Janie.
I was really intrigued by the relationship between public services and private services and the way that they interacted. So it seemed like she must have been on Medicaid at some point.
Yes.
Which I don't normally think of as paying for therapy, which is able to access that. And then the importance of SSDI at a later stage. And I wondered if you could just reflect on that a little bit, because it does seem like the private resources were able to, they were like multipliers for the public resources as well as advocates for them. And I wondered.
Right, and I think that's a great way to think about it. They were multipliers of the kind of public services. So when we think about particularly safety net, the safety net, and what's the state of our safety net post-1996 welfare reform? And I think the interesting thing about this model is that it shows, and I think you're really hitting upon it, Jane, this kind of public private partnership that takes place, where the basic kind of, first of all, a lot of these organizations are funded through private donations, but also through the government, right, through Ryan White funds. But they are really creating a nice division of labor in terms of what the activist community is doing and what the AIDS community is doing versus what kind of a larger safety net is doing. So absolutely critical that Dawn's able to connect to the Social Security system when she needs to. Absolutely critical that she's able to get health care, but part of how she navigates that healthcare system is through these organizational relationships that come in and help her figure out how to navigate the system, help her figure out how to qualify, help her figure out, okay, we're going to get economic assistance from Social Security, but you still need resources for food and housing. So an AIDS organization comes in and takes care of the housing piece by giving her a voucher. And that's a public-private partnership too, because the AIDS Foundation of Chicago works with the Chicago Housing Authority to basically execute its own kind of Section 8 system in some ways. So there's, to give people housing vouchers for folks who are living with HIV. So there's ways in which these very well networked AIDS organizations are coming into the public system and saying, we have a population that needs assistance, we're very good at direct service delivery, we just need some more resources to do it. And through that, they have been relatively successful in terms of being able to address holistically the needs of the women that we study. Yes.
I'll ask, actually, if you don't mind, I have two questions.
Okay, sure.
One is, we discussed last night, which is, given that the HIV/AIDS infrastructure was established more or less in a state of emergency,
Mm-hmm.
what do you make of the push towards normalization
Yes.
of HIV as not an exceptional chronic disease, but a
Mhm.
chronic disease like diabetes or like
Mhm.
any heart disease or any other chronic disease?
Mm-hmm.
What does that have? It's certainly being pushed as advantageous to the individuals because of issues of stigma and the support. But it does seem that there's some tension there with what you're describing.
Right, right.
The second question comes out of a paper my advisor, Lori Leonard, wrote called The Story of My Life, Autobiographical Occasions in AIDS,
Mm-hmm.
in which she, and this is about personal responsibility, this idea of fixing things, I think a respectability
Mhm.
issue,
Mm-hmm.
which is the advantage, according to Lori's article, that in her case also the younger women living with HIV have, who can package their story
Mm-hmm.
and their identity and their narrative in ways that appeal to the services that have been put in place.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder about the tension there between what those institutions expect,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's a voucher program or a support group that you're leading or a political mobilization, advocacy group,
Mm-hmm.
what they expect from the people who are living with HIV in
Yeah.
terms of personal responsibility.
Yeah.
And how you see that playing out in the lives of Dawn and other people who may not be as successful as she has been.
Yeah, that's a good question. So let me address the first question first around kind of the normalization of HIV. I think it is really a double-edged sword because I appreciate the drive towards normalization, but I'm really concerned about this infrastructure. And what I would really kind of encourage us to think about is there a way in which, if we think more broadly about this infrastructure, maybe it doesn't have to be solely specified around HIV status, right? So if I had the magic policy wand, if this were available to all low-income women, then I wouldn't need HIV. We wouldn't need HIV to have this kind of be this designated category. So that's one response. But in terms of the more realistic, immediate, I think this is going to be a real challenge and issue. Because with the normalization, if it's harder to justify Ryan White funding, for example, if it's harder to justify this kind of individualized support, like, not every disease is able to go to the housing authority and say, we'd like to do a housing program for people who are living with this illness. So, it's really going to be something to watch and to watch carefully and to see if those kind of cuts happen, what then happens in terms of the infection rates and numbers and what's happening to people in terms of whether this transformative project really becomes possible, right? So the second question relates to narrative. I think narrative is extremely important. So one of the things that we talk about in the Framing Institutions article that LaShonda and Jean and I wrote was the idea that part of what these institutions are doing is giving women a language to talk about their situation. So as we interviewed women, we would hear even the same kind of phrases and discourse of, I've got to be careful about people, places, and things that, that challenge my ability to take care of myself. Bringing that from the drug and alcohol rehab language and moving it into the realm of HIV. But it was a set of language, it was language that women were using. And what I think is for people, so I hear in your question the question and the concern of, for people who aren't willing to adopt this language, right, who aren't willing to kind of tell this narrative, what happens to them? And I do think there's a challenge, because part of what is being built is this kind of ethos and culture that the women are buying into, and through that participation, they're able to get services. So where we really see that challenge is with the middle income women. And I could do a whole talk on middle class women living with HIV, because this is not their story, right? So part of what they struggle with is they are actually more socially isolated as it relates to their HIV status, because they're not tapped into this network, because they say, look, I haven't been homeless, I don't have this drug and alcohol history, I have not experienced this kind of existence, so I don't find myself buying into this culture and this language, and I'm not really interested in this. What happens is they end up highly socially isolated, so that the only people that they're talking to about their HIV infection are their doctors and their therapists, right? So they are talking to somebody, but it's through private, it's me and my pastor, it's me and my therapist, but they miss the group interaction that I think can sometimes be valuable. So I think for those who aren't, kind of participating in that narrative, the middle class women end up pretty socially isolated. The low income women who aren't willing to do this are not only socially isolated, but they're also losing out on really important resources. So it becomes a real challenge for them. And they are the ones that I would tend to characterize as the kind of dying from group. I think it's hard to live with HIV as a low-income woman if you're not willing to kind of participate in this kind of conversation around how do we, make changes. Okay, and we're on until 5:30.
And it's 5:30.
Okay, great. This was so, you all have an intuitive sense of closure for these events. Thank you so much. This was such an exciting conversation. Thank you so much for the feedback. I'm going to really think about it as I, take this back to the lab and work on the book. Thank you so much.
Please do join us for the reception outside, just in the atrium. Eat and drink and be merry.